Hardcore wrestling was originally defined as having a hard-working and dedicated attitude towards fans and the art of professional wrestling, no matter what it takes. But as ECW grew in popularity, many outsiders only noticed the violence and simply equated the two things as being together. So when companies like the WWF decided they wanted a no DQ championship, Hardcore was the name that they gave it, thus creating a misconception of the term that would last till this day. But for all intents and purposes, definitions can change. So while initially the terms hardcore and extreme were mutually exclusive ideas, today the term hardcore has come to mean no disqualifications, anything goes, all out brawls. And even though there are those in the wrestling community that actually look down on the practice, I personally think that hardcore wrestling, as people have come to know it today, is a much more complicated subject than most people give it credit for. Fortunately, it's the topic of this episode, because today, Dave knows going to the extreme. Rules were made to be broken, as the old saying goes, so it's no surprise that wrestling without rules is not anything new. It seems that as early as wrestling had regulations, there was always a market for those wanting to see those regulations go away. During ancient Greek times, Sparta was known for not having any regulations in the way that wrestling did in other parts of Greece. In the late 1800s, England had such a high demand for wrestlers that they actually hired less skilled competitors who were given weapons to overcompensate for their lack of ability. Even the term lucha libre actually means free fighting due to the style initially stemming from a form of fighting without any regulations. And that was, for the most part, how hardcore wrestling began to gain momentum in the modern era. Promoters started noticing that hot-shotting was a surefire way to gain attention, advertising matches as having unusual stipulations or promising high levels of violence as a good way to make sure that people bought a ticket. Now, hot-shotting does draw its fair share of criticism, saying that it only works in the short term, because eventually promoters would either have to keep topping themselves with over-the-top matches or face a crowd that had grown bored with the routine. However, while it may not have long-lasting revenue for a particular promotion, the impact of hardcore wrestling from this time definitely has its lasting effects even till today, because topping themselves is exactly what many promotions tried to do. Now, as it pertains to the more relatively modern era, in the early 1900s, the term hardcore wrestling really didn't exist. The popular phrase of the time was no holds barred. The idea that no physical hold or maneuver would be banned from use started to gain a lot of momentum. Take a style like Greco-Roman, for example, which had become pretty dominant. There are strict rules about holds below the waist, and while freestyle did have more freedom, you still couldn't bite, eye gouge, or even punch for that matter. No holds barred meant that every man-to-man combat option was available. Next, blood began to get people talking. I mean, think about it, how often do you actually see blood in an amateur wrestling match anyway, right? Now, as much as many people won't admit it, and as much as people might squirm at the sight of it, bloodlust does create a bit of a morbid thrill in many people. The mere sight of blood got audiences' attention, and they became so excited that they would actually keep coming back in hopes of seeing more. But if they didn't get what they came for, they were not all that likely to come back. So wrestlers like Classy Freddie Blassie and Dory Funk Sr. actually began doing what's called blading, cutting themselves on purpose to get some color for the audience. And the act of blading itself could actually get its own episode, so I'll just move on. So at this point, violence was beginning to make a comeback in America, which is really just the nature of wrestling. Things go in secular cycles from place to place and from time to time. And as the century rolled on, hardcore was definitely back in fashion. Match types devised around the idea of things getting extreme were created to up the ante. This is when we start seeing things like street fights and lights out matches and unsanctioned matches that were allegedly not approved by the organization. Kinda like Seth Rollins and Triple H at WrestleMania 33, like I said, it's all just secular. And while some of these matches may not quench bloodlust now like they did back then, there was a time when a lot of these match types were really seen as ultra-violent spectacles. Take the cage match, for example. The cage meant you were getting a bloodbath because the cage was actually there to cut people open. Not like today where it's mostly used just to keep managers out. Or how about the brass knuckle brawl? The NWA even had a World Brass Knuckle Championship in Tennessee for 2 years, which saw wrestlers like Gypsy Joe and Don Fargo dominate the division. In addition to all this glorious mayhem, leather strap matches, scaffold matches, and ladder matches would also begin to spring up. Also, what was more common than it probably should have been, bear matches. And no, I don't mean matches between two bears. Wrestlers like Roddy Piper and Tracy Smothers have had actual matches where they fought real live bears. Now, the bears were usually declawed, detoothed, and or muzzled, and were usually smaller in size than your average bear. But even with these precautions, bears don't know that wrestling's fake. And as a result, there have even been some wrestlers who have lost limbs. And other animals were also used too. Stu Hart, in fact, even wrestled a tiger. Man, people are crazy. Now, Extreme took a different direction in Puerto Rico. Carlos Colon continued to grow his legend by defeating Hercules Ayala in a fire match, which is no surprise that Puerto Rico would make a fire match famous. After all, many people believe that Puerto Rico is the birthplace of the first time a wrestler ever used a foreign object. Many names would become famous off of just how brutal their matches would be. The Sheik, the Invader, Abdullah the Butcher were all just some of hardcore wrestling's founding fathers. Abby was especially known for taking forks to people's heads. And if you look at his own face, you'll notice that while he can't dish it out, he can definitely take it too. Also, hardcore wrestling really took off in the American South, which gave birth to the Texas Deathmatch, also known as the Mexican Deathmatch, which is a lot like a last man standing match, except a combatant must be pinned or submitted first, then a 10 count begins. If the competitor still hasn't gotten to his feet by then, well, then he loses. But you can't talk about a Texas Deathmatch in an episode about hardcore wrestling without bringing up the Japanese Deathmatch. Because outside of the American South, Japan really took off with the idea of extremely violent wrestling. Now the real deathmatch is hardcore wrestling at its opus. And other than the no DQ thing, Japan's deathmatch is nothing like the Texas version. Now it was birthed from the promotion Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling. FMW was created by Atsushi Onita in 1989. And the promotion grew more and more popular thanks to the success of the Extreme Deathmatch. These hardcore style matches drew wild crowds, not just because of the rules they lacked, but also for the types of foreign objects that they actually brought to the mix. In addition to the previously mentioned hazards, the FMW also brought barbed wire, C4, landmines, bricks, nails, and or any kind of assorted chaos that the match called for. In addition, FMW also started the rarely seen female hardcore matches as well. Now, imitation is said to be the best form of flattery, so it should be no surprise that FMW inspired many imitators. Wrestling International New Generations, Big Japan Pro Wrestling, and of course the International Wrestling Association of Japan all followed after FMW. In fact, the IWA was founded by promoter Victor Quiñones, who served as a special manager for the FMW at one point. And speaking of the IWA, now not surprising at all, but by this time wrestlers like Tarzan Goto and other pioneers of the deathmatch really didn't have much in the way of career longevity. So after a few years, many had begun to either move on from the style or retire from the business altogether. But one early star of Japan's deathmatch hung on to work with the new blood in IWA. And blood is exactly what they got. Because August 20th, 1995 is the official date of the IWA show called Kawasaki Dream, held in the Kawasaki Baseball Stadium, and it would feature as the main attraction the first ever 8-man single elimination King of the Death Match tournament. Each match in the tournament had its own set of specific weaponry, and the finals of the tournament would be the stuff of legend. Cactus Jack versus Terry Funk in a barbed wire rope, exploding barbed wire board, and exploding ring time bomb death match. And at the end of the night, the tournament winner and king of the deathmatch was Cactus Jack. Now because of this, many simply think that the deathmatch always has to have an exploding ring, but this is a bit of a misnomer. Sure, some would say that the best deathmatches would end with an exploding ring, but it's important to note that it's not really a necessity. There have been plenty of crazy deathmatch stipulations out there that had nothing to do with explosions, some of which included cut wrestlers being thrown into pools of lemon juice and salt, light tube matches, piranha tank matches, which had to be the idea of a James Bond villain, and so many variations of barbed wire matches, as well as the infamous alligator in a tank match. And that's just to name a few. Now for the home stretch, because over in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Eastern Championship Wrestling was about to go to the extreme. Now I want to save a lot of this for a future episode dedicated to the history of ECW, but in short, Eastern Championship Wrestling and the hardcore style that many would associate with the brand stem from two independent promotions, the Tri-State Wrestling Alliance in Philadelphia and the National Wrestling Federation in New York. These two companies set the stage in terms of violent matches, specific venues, and many wrestlers in the Northeast. And when these two small promotions closed, the NWA's Eastern Championship Wrestling was there to pick up the pieces. Extreme Championship Wrestling proved to be so indicative of the 90s with their in-your-face attitude that the WWF and WCW could not ignore this for long. ECW talent became highly sought, with certain ECW alumni succeeding outside of the Philadelphia-based promotion, and some even managed to bring their own hardcore style with them. Raven, Rob Van Dam, the Dudley Boys all managed to bring the extreme to the mainstream. ECW's influence affected wrestling in a way that no other promotion has done ever since. As Paul Heyman put it, rock music since the 80s had been dominated by the glam metal of hair bands for far too long. Then all of a sudden, Nirvana hit the scene, and rock music would be changed forever. And as far as Heyman was concerned, wrestling too needed its Nirvana. Following ECW's success, new violent promotions began to appear in America, much in the same way that they started appearing in Japan after FMW. The International Wrestling Syndicate, Extreme Pro Wrestling, and of course Combat Zone Wrestling all arrived, inspired by the violent aspects of ECW. Which brings us to today. Now, even though hardcore wrestling has almost all but faded from the mainstream, just remember, wrestling is secular, and all things that are old are new again. And you never know, anytime now, wrestling might just finally get its new Nirvana. And there you go, a quick history of hardcore wrestling. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again, and this has been Dave Knows.